My name is Annika Nicola Sponder, and I am Team Leader of Sustainability and Innovation at ICAM, the Institute for Climate Protection, Energy and Mobility, based in Berlin. Today it's my pleasure to tell you about the lessons and inspirations from the Interreg project Baltic InteGrid, which I had the pleasure of leading from 2016 to 2019 when it ended. It was a really wonderful experience. I'm a very big fan of Interreg. The programs in general, they take place all over Europe, but of course the Baltic Sea region has a special place in my heart. I'm going to start sharing my slides now. I mentioned already, I'm from ICAM, the Institute for Climate Protection, Energy and Mobility, and we're going to talk about the Baltic InteGrid. So what was the Baltic InteGrid all about? Well, we set out to investigate the potential of a meshed offshore grid in the Baltic Sea region. Now, what is a Baltic meshed offshore grid? It is an innovative way to connect offshore wind farms as well as national electricity markets, and it can optimize the development of offshore wind energy in the Baltic Sea region. The way that we're doing offshore wind today is that offshore wind farms are radially connected to a country, say country A, and if that country wants to trade electricity with country B, for instance, they build interconnector infrastructure separately. A meshed offshore grid would combine these two grid infrastructures into one, and it would save space in the seabed, it requires less cable infrastructure, and it would be more cost efficient. So what we wanted to figure out is, could this work in the Baltic Sea region? We discovered there are several pros and cons, even though the pros largely outweigh the cons. I'm not going to go into too much detail because the focus of this presentation is more about the benefits of cross-border cooperation in the context of these kinds of projects. Now, the way that we set about investigating the topic of offshore wind, combined offshore wind and grid infrastructure in the Baltic Sea region was through a two-pronged approach, through networking, events, collecting stakeholders together and building momentum region-wide, and also through research. And for that, we had these two different things, the forum, which was our networking platform, and the concept, which was our interdisciplinary research. So yeah, let's start with the forum and the networking. Well, a meshed offshore grid, it's a cross-border or a regional kind of concept by its very definition. It requires several countries to commit to and to plan and to operate this common energy infrastructure. So it's very much regional in scope. It cannot really be addressed by a single country or even by two countries on their own. It really requires the exchange and cooperation among many different stakeholders from different countries with different disciplinary backgrounds. So we needed offshore wind industry at the table. We needed policymakers, local, but also national, and of course, EU to join the discussions. We needed environmental experts, spatial planners, and much more. And all of these people needed to start getting into dialogue with each other to identify obstacles, think of solutions and benefits, and move this idea forward. So to make that happen, we implemented a Baltic offshore grid forum. So during the 3 years of our project, we implemented 22 different events. Some of them were thematic in scope, focusing on policy or market or technology. Some of them were national in scope, focusing on interesting markets like Poland or Latvia. And some of them were like large, very festive conferences that were interdisciplinary and international. So during those 22 events, we really created a lot of momentum, created a really large network of 1,000+ stakeholders, experts, decision makers, who were all interested in this idea of a meshed offshore grid. So they were high-level conferences, very glossy and businesslike, hands-on workshops where we were really trying to do some kind of design thinking, solution-oriented problem solving, panel discussions with EU decision makers. These were all ingredients that helped us build this international network. During these events, of course, you get a lot of really interesting input from national experts, from policymakers, from maritime spatial planners. We used all of that input and integrated it into our research, our Baltic offshore grid concepts, which in this interdisciplinary kind of layout, as you see here, produced a roadmap towards a meshed offshore grid in the Baltic Sea region. So what do we need to see? What kind of action do we need to see from EU and national policymakers? What kind of commitments also from TSOs, from industry leaders? What kind of environmental mitigation or precaution steps should we take to make sure that this is done in as non-invasive a way as possible, of course, to preserve this very precious maritime space that is the Baltic Sea. And this interdisciplinary research was an output of our experts from within the consortium, but also from all of the the events and stakeholder interviews that we conducted during the projects. And like I mentioned, cross-border cooperation and interdisciplinarity was at the core of the project. And I think that that's true for a lot of Interreg projects out there. Our consortium, it was a really wonderful partnership. We had 14 partners from 8 different EU member states around the Baltic Sea region, so really covering the entire terrain, so to speak. And the partners were also interdisciplinary in nature. So we had industry representatives, we had civil society and environmental organizations, maritime spatial planners, academia, tech experts, and of course, research institutes like ICAM. Yeah, and I think that kind of is a segue to the next point, which is also kind of the core of my message. I think cross-border cooperation is really, really important to the Baltic InteGrid, but also to Interreg in general, I think. Most of the projects that are being pitched to the Interreg program are quite complex in nature and just really require this kind of cross-border cooperation. I mean, we often focus on challenges related to blue energy or clean seas or clean renewable energy, and that all relates to things like pollution or climate change. These are topics that are too big for one single country to address. Like, these issues transcend borders, also disciplines, and it also requires for countries to work across borders to address them. And I think that's really interesting fun about Interreg, because of course, these kinds of projects, there's funding on national levels as well. In Germany, where I am based, there are really great programs that can support innovative research projects, but they're often very much national in scope. And again, these kinds of topics that our generation is facing right now, they are often international in scope. And then I think Interreg is really uniquely suited to support that, and to really also build on the unique identity of the region, whether it's the Baltic Sea or an Interreg program in Central Europe. I love that really tailored approach, building on existing strengths and partnerships and making the region shine. Something that I also thought was really interesting with Interreg in general, a lot of the concepts that are being investigated there, the topics that projects are covering, are very innovative in nature, and they're not necessarily easily funded on the market. So even though they serve the public interest, it's for the common good, you know, whether it's clean energy through a meshed offshore grid or increased mobility in rural areas. These are topics that we all should work more on, and we should see more research and funding go into that, but it's not something that is going to be easily funded in the private sector. So for that kind of sustainable innovation, programs like Interreg are and will probably remain for the foreseeable future extremely important. And they also help drive these innovative concepts from the abstract into kind of the more like reality of policymaking or project implementation. For instance, just from my perspective, the topic of a meshed offshore grid was quite new when we wrote the proposal in 2015, which is like 6 years ago. Yes, 6 years ago. It was very innovative and abstract, and a lot of like also policymakers and transmission system operators thought that it was like way too far-fetched. And now we're 6 years further on, and it's thanks to projects like the Baltic InteGrid that do research on this topic, that make it more tangible, that ideas like a meshed offshore grid have gone much more into mainstream policymaking. We're seeing concepts being developed in the North Sea. There's even an energy island that was also going to be connected to several countries in the Baltic Sea being developed by the offshore wind developer Ørsted. So it's really, a driver of innovation, I think, for especially sustainable innovation that Interreg here is providing. So yeah, those are my words on cross-border cooperation and the big added value that Interreg offers in that regards. I think it's a great platform for regional projects that serve the common goods, that are of common interest. And I really look forward to seeing what comes next from the Interreg program. Okay, so that's all for me. I had a great, as I mentioned, experience working with the Interreg Baltic Sea Region program. I hope that people watching this are currently implementing projects or thinking about implementing projects. Highly encourage you to do so. It was a really enriching experience. And I hope to hear from you if you have any questions or comments.